Good evening, and welcome to CrossCurrents, produced by the City of Fort Collins in cooperation with the Larimer County League of Women Voters. I'm Mary Dietrich, the moderator for tonight's program. The numerical industry of the future in the 1950s was plastics. Jump to 2018. Today, a store in Hong Kong actually sells cans of Cokes individually wrapped in a plastic tray and covered with plastic wrap. You can buy a special machine in England that goes next to your front door, and you put your foot on it and it wraps your shoe in plastic so that when you don't have to take your shoe off when you go into your home. A gas station in Massachusetts has a machine that dispenses single-use gloves to cover your hands when you pump your gas. And in many craft and big box stores last week, you could buy a pumpkin that is no mess, made of styrofoam, if you think styrofoam doesn't make a mess. Easier to carve, and you can even buy a plastic battery-operated knife to carve it. Since plastics entered our lives in the 1950s, they have provided convenience, safety, long use, economy of scale, ease of transportation, and even saving lives in the medical community. It's made our lives so much easier in so many ways. But have we gone too far? 10% of our oil use goes to plastics. And in 2016, world plastics production totaled around 335 million metric tons. Roughly half of that annual plastic production is destined for single-use products like this cup. Most of that will end up in landfills, in turtle stomachs, or even in our bodies. Are many of these single-use plastics needed, or is the environmental impact of them overstated? These rather strange single-use plastics I mentioned earlier don't even begin to compare to the 1 million plastic bottles bought every minute worldwide that are used once and thrown where? In the U.S., only 23% are recycled. And plastic bags, boy, they seem to have ignited the biggest debate. Several U.S. states have even gone so far to ban cities from banning plastic bags. Some critics say that these single-use plastics are the most destructive elements in our environment. Others say they are less destructive and costly than the alternatives. Can we reach a consensus about the magnitude of the problem and its possible solutions? For years, China bought about 45% of the world's recycled plastics, but that has stopped. What are we going to do? Throw it in a landfill? Plastics that in a landfill may take 50 years or more to break down. Whose responsibility is this? Is it industry? Is it the government? Is it the consumer? Much of this plastic ends up in our oceans and on our beaches. If this ocean dumping continues by 2050, there may be more plastic by weight in our oceans than fish. But even if we can clean that up, what do we do with the plastic we collect? Joining us tonight to look at this issue are, on my right, Honore Depew, Environmental Planner for the City of Fort Collins. Welcome. Next to Honore is John Clarke, former County Commissioner. Next to him is Kevin Duggan, a columnist with the Colorado newspaper. And finally, we have Mike Pruznick, a community enthusiast. Sip of water. Welcome this evening.
Thank you.
Let's start with the role plastics play in our lives. What role do you see it playing? What's important? What isn't important? And why should we be concerned about it, or should we be concerned about it? Anybody want to start?
No.
Go ahead.
I'm happy to set the stage. Thanks for having me tonight, Mary. Plastics are low cost. They're generally hygienic, durable, and convenient overall. And so they've become very ubiquitous in our society and across the world. Of course, as you mentioned, they come mostly from non-renewable sources, and many of them tend to be disposable. In some cases, the manufacturing of plastics can be quite toxic. Think of PVC pipe, there's some pretty harmful effects associated with the manufacturing of some plastics. And especially the low quality plastic tends to be very hard to recycle and find its way into new products. And then, as you already mentioned, much of it ends up as litter, unfortunately, and it takes hundreds of years at least to break down, and even then it just breaks into smaller and smaller pieces. So there's some real challenges with managing it responsibly.
John?
Seems to me that plastic at this point in our history is something you can't live, but it also seems like maybe we're going to have trouble living without it. We obviously have a problem. China, as you mentioned, is not taking that material anymore. At least they've changed their regulations quite a bit, so they've eliminated certain types of plastic. They've reduced the amount of, for lack of a better word, pollution that you can have in the plastic. I did a little research and found out that they used to accept plastic that had 10% pollution. They've reduced that to 1.5, 1/2%. Right now, our landfill, where we have what we call single stream recycling, is running 30%. So there's not a prayer we're going to get even close to what they need. So if people clean up their plastics before they throw it away, then all of a sudden we see we have more need for water. It just gets real complicated real fast.
When you say 30% in the landfill, is that the amount of plastic that's recycled?
Well, that's polluted.
That's polluted.
That's the level of pollution in the plastic they receive out there. That's according to Stephen Gillette, who's the natural resources guy for the county.
So that means if this cup is not clean,
then it's considered polluted. That one looks pretty clean.
The other word,
it is clean.
the other word that we use for that is contamination.
Contamination.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's kind of
made up pollution just to cover the subject. But
the amount of
it's
trash in the
contaminated.
recycling.
And so if we're running 30%, we're not going to have much chance to recycle what's going in. The other thing is there are some articles out there that tell us, here's one out of the New York Times that says your recycling gets recycled, right? Maybe or maybe not. When we don't have a market for that material, it usually just gets put in a landfill. It's very possible that some of the stuff that we recycle right here in Fort Collins, and we all work hard, and we've got 2 trucks coming down our streets and everything, winds up in the landfill and not recycled.
Kevin?
Well, plastics certainly touch every aspect of our lives and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. The numbers that we hear about plastics are just astonishing, including some that you just quoted and John here. From my perspective, I think we can't do much about China, but we can do things on the local level that I would hope can make a difference in the amount of pollution that we have in Fort Collins, in Larimer County, in Colorado, and make a difference.
Michael, what's your take on this?
I think you did a really good job in the introduction talking about, the relationship of plastics and them coming into existence. They're not a necessity, and they are a luxury. They improve quality of life, but where did they come from? We used to have something else, and then we found a better mousetrap at a lower price, and now we're at a point where maybe got so involved in that, right? Now we're starting to see the waste and the negative impacts of that. And, kind of the attitude I like to take on it is what will be the next mousetrap at a better price? And, we started this meeting out, we got handed these nice little stainless steel straws. Is that the solution? I don't know yet, but I certainly like, that innovative thought in America, that free market enterprise to let's start looking for solutions to this trash, to the problem of the pollution that comes from the plastics.
I have a friend who ordered some stainless steel straws from one of the major shippers out there. We all know who they are. And it came in a cardboard box. 7 straws came in a cardboard box the size of a shoe box, and it was stuffed with plastic bag fillers. So, and when we talk about plastics and we talk about how half of the plastics out there are single use, it seems to be a bit overwhelming. So I think there's a consensus that it's something that we should be concerned about. Let's talk a little bit more about what happens to recycling here locally. How are plastics handled? And, everything from packaging. What's the hardest thing to recycle?
Well, there are a lot of things that are hard to recycle. It's important to remember that the curbside recycling system is designed for the most basic types of plastic. We're talking about cans, bottles, paper, cardboard, or basic household recycling. It's not really designed to handle plastic film and bulky items or hoses or plastic bags. And so those items, many of them can be recycled as long as they're taken to certain locations that can actually handle them, like the Timberline Recycling Center. I would say one of the hardest things that the industry is facing right now is the rise of those little pouches, the like multi-layer film. You see, the baby food aisle used to be all these little glass jars. Well, now it's these little convenient one sample, rip off the top pouches. And you see that in juice boxes. You see that all across manufacturing. And in some ways, it's has less of a footprint, but it is beguiling the recycling systems out there. So that one's really a bit of a challenge right now.
Well, according to some of the research I did in preparation for tonight, picked up an article. This was written by a gentleman named Adam Minter and also co-written by Faye Flom, F-L-A-M. This was published in Bloomberg, and it kind of put some things in perspective for me. One of the comments in this article is there's a misconception surrounding responsibility for plastics and the recycling issue. And the first is that it originates out of individual actions. In fact, less than 10% of the waste generated in the US, Canada, and the European Union comes from households. Instead, it's further up the production chain, farms, factories, distribution points, the stuff they ship to your friend her straws with, and so on. So if we as individuals only have control over 10% of what's causing the problem, it tells me that we're going to probably have to appeal to some people who are taking care of that 90% to get them to be involved in this as well.
Okay,
But
Mike?
wouldn't you say there's value in what we do as individuals?
Of course, but when you say if I could cut my plastic recycling or recycle more and cut my waste in half, and everybody did that, you've only affected 5%. Now you still got 95% to deal with. The 5% that we weren't able to take care of personally, plus the other 90% that somebody else has to take care of. That's a hard one because we're all working hard and we're committed to recycling, and I think it's a great idea. But first of all, some of it's winding up in landfills. Second of all, even if we did 100%, that's only 10% of the problem.
Well, and so much of it is difficult to recycle. Honore and I were speaking about the MacArthur Foundation and their circular approach to the program. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think this really goes to what John was speaking of. A lot of companies around the world and corporations are working towards coming up with new systems for the products that they design, new designs to the actual material so that they can be more easily recycled at the end of their life. It's a slow going. We're nowhere near a circular economy, which is the ideal. But yeah, as you say, the MacArthur Foundation has tried to jumpstart some research and networking around this new plastics economy. So there's hope of the future, but as you said, we often say 7 bags of trash, maybe upstream for every bag of trash you put out on the curb, and it's no small element of it, for sure.
Let me just throw one other thing out here real quick and give others a chance. Minter goes on in this article he wrote to say, the second misconception is that developed countries are the source of the problem. A 2015 study points out that the vast majority of ocean plastics, which really never wind up in a landfill or they wind up in the ocean instead of a landfill, actually originate in developing countries. So that's the majority of that plastic comes from developing countries. Without good waste management systems, no trash pickups and informal landfills. So this problem gets more complicated as you move. And those of us here in Fort Collins, we can do what we should do and what we can do, but realize that's a very small part of what's going on worldwide.
But if I could add a little more context to that, because I am aware of that, information, and unfortunately, a lot of our recycling and trash has ended up in those developing countries, and they've traced a lot of that plastic waste back to the contribution that the industrial world has made to that waste stream, and it's a mixture of responsibility.
Okay. So film and plastic bags seem to be a huge issue. Should we just stop using these? How much of plastic bags a problem? This is one of the things I'm having the hardest time dealing with. It's like, how do I get rid of these convenient little food storage bags?
Well, for those little storage bags, quit buying them.
Quit buying them. I'm going to. I
Yeah.
think I'm going to.
But then the bigger picture, and one of the issues that I think spurred this conversation was the possibility of the Fort Collins revisiting the plastic bag ban, or at least a discussion about how to deal with single-use plastic bags. And about 4 years ago, we went through a very painful process and discussion about what to do with it. And these gentlemen were involved in the fight against it, and I was reporting on it at the time. Didn't have opinions in those days. Now I do, as it turns out. And I think that's an issue, again, from a local perspective that we should take up again and talk about, all right, what might the city do in terms of regulating the use of single plastic bags? And I'm talking about the kind of bags you get at the grocery store and even retailers. What difference can be made there? And I think that's a place to start. I absolutely understand what John is saying in terms of the overall impact of such an action on the world and even Colorado. But I still think it is worth discussing.
Mike.
Yeah, I definitely think we can continue the discussion on the subject. I think there were a lot of problems that came up with the ordinance that was the first time around, and that's, it started out in first reading as a reasonable ordinance, and then it really morphed in second reading. And that's where a lot of the objections came from and the problems came from. But again, going back to like the free market, right? At the time, I had a business that was using these biodegradable, certified compostable bags. And for anyone who would like one, they're on the back table. You could take one with you. The city was trying to ban these bags along with paper bags. And at the time, and still today, I went to the city's website today, we can recycle plastic bags, but we still can't recycle durable bags, or at least there's no place on the city's website to give us that direction. And so it's more than just a conversation of a silo of, is this bag a problem, right? We need to kind of look more at that comprehensive and systematic approach of the whole thing. And sometimes the answer isn't, let's throw the baby out with the bathwater, but maybe the answer is, maybe this is the better mousetrap at the lower price, and maybe we should look at supporting it. Maybe it's an interim solution until we get to a better solution. But to just go out and say, bags are evil, let's ban them, that just biases the conversation. We really need to sit down and really listen to both sides, listen to the impacts, see where everything's going, and really make a data-driven decision on what actually does the best job, protecting the environment, protecting quality of life, and where is that balance if it needs to be balanced, and how can we move forward together as opposed to winners and losers and picking one side where it always feels like the government's coming in and saying, you must do it my way, and then you must do it my way, and everyone feels beat up. We really need to start these conversations where everyone feels like we're the rising tide that's floating all ships, and we're all working together. And sometimes maybe we don't win, but it's not about, we lose.
What is it that makes this plastic bag compostable?
You know, it's been too long since I've looked at it, but I'd looked it up at the time, and it's got something to do with the way it works, and it can be sunlight causes it to break down, if I remember correctly.
Well, and I've got some eco-friendly substitutes for plastic. A lot of times you mix something in with it that will cause it to break down. Strangely, one of my favorites in here is chicken feathers. I'm serious. When I read that, I thought, come on. But we have a problem with chicken feathers in this country. We have too many. Don't know how to get rid of them.
Feathers.
But we can mix them in with plastic, and then it'll. It's biodegradable.
Well, I know I was in Hawaii last year, and they've pretty much banned plastic bags. They did it by county rather than a statewide ban, but they're pretty much gone, and they've also done that with straws. And I was talking to a merchant about the straws, and she says, well, we were using compostable straws, but they're compostable, but it takes some time for them to dissolve, and they can still do damage to the wildlife in the meantime, and the same with the plastic bags. And that the plastic bags that need sunlight to decompose, once they get buried in a landfill, they may never decompose.
So this is one of those points of confusion that does come up a lot, and it relates to trying to replace a convenient disposable item like a plastic to-go box or a plastic bag with one that is touted to be earth-friendly because it's compostable. And so those compostable products that are handed out at restaurants or in other places, they need to make their way into a recycling system, a composting system in this case, for organic material. And so if they end up in landfills, they actually are doing harm because they're breaking down without oxygen, just like food waste or yard trimmings, and then they're releasing methane gas. However, if they end up in the environment as litter, they do have the advantage of eventually going back to the earth. So it's a complex question, but it is sometimes more challenging from an environmental standpoint to serve the more expensive compostable to-go boxes and things like that.
They do cost more, that's for sure, but the cost could come down, as you point out. One thing I wanted to hit on real quick is the idea that Mike and I did spend a lot of time trying to block that particular ordinance. And I agree with him, it was a bad one. But I still think it's a valuable thing to try and control the bags, use something like he's just shown you. But beyond that, even if you're going to use plastic bags, the best thing would be to get people not to use them at all. And instead of, I prefer not banning things. I'm not real wild about government banning things. In Hawaii, they have a special problem. They don't have much land, and it's extremely expensive. Their landfills just are kind of not a possibility, and they're not going to put it in the ocean. Tourists get mad. It's terrible. But
Well, they have enough of a problem with the plastic gyra out there dumping plastics on the beaches in Hawaii.
But let me make just one point real quick, and that is that if we're going to do something to get people to not use those single-use bags in stores, especially, we ought to use a carrot instead of a club. Instead of government making a rule, let's figure out a way that we can encourage the retailers not to use those things. And by giving people a little discount if they don't take it home in one of those bags. Bringing their own bags would save them some money. You can do that by giving them a credit against the sales tax they pay and giving them away so that the store can say, hey, well, yeah, I'm going to encourage people by giving them a discount, and I'm going to receive a benefit from sales tax. Fort Collins is one of the few communities that has a tax on food. We have 2.25% of our sales tax in this town on food. The state doesn't tax it. Most of the other taxes that have been passed for special uses have open space and such have exempted food, but we're in a position where we are collecting sales tax on food in this town, and we're in a position to go ahead and give people a break in business if they encourage people in turn to do the right thing.
Anybody familiar with what's going on in Norway? With recycling? They've turned it over to the industry, and they've placed a tax on the past plastics that, especially the single-use water bottles and soda bottles, the tax on the companies that produce those, And then they turned around and said, let's put a deposit on those. And if you can prove to us that you are recycling at least 85% of the plastic that you produce, then you don't have to pay the tax. So it's kind of a mixed bag of carrot and punishment. And the consumer benefits too, because they get a reward when they return their bottles to the store.
It's a form of extended producer responsibility, and you see that in a number of states in the U.S. with bottles and cans with the deposit programs. Here we have Paint Care Colorado. It's the only example of that product stewardship model currently in Colorado, and you pay a couple of extra cents or a buck or two on a gallon or 5-gallon can of paint, and that pays for a program that allows you to return it to any number of drop-off locations at no additional fee for recycling. So there are models out there of that.
Okay.
Well, and there are other ways for a local government to address the bag issue again. It doesn't have to be a ban. It could be a fee. In some places it's a tax. The model is different around the country and even around the world. And so I think I agree with you, John, in terms of it's great to give people incentive to not use bags, plastic bags, single-use bags, but I think it also helps at times to hit them in the pocketbook, frankly. Even if it's 5 cents, 20 cents, that motivates people to think and not use a single-use bag.
Well, let me just clear one thing up. That ordinance was not a ban. It was a fee. And what was it, a dime, Mike? Something like that.
The final one.
I think it started as a dime, then went
Yeah.
down to a nickel.
it got really
Well, it wound up to be
complicated.
a nickel. Well, see, so that wasn't a ban. And
Right.
it was one of those things, but I prefer to do it on the other end and make it the right thing for people to do and reward them. Norway's
I
an
get
interesting
10 cents.
situation.
I get 10 cents every time I use my grocery bag at the store.
You do?
Yeah.
Well, good for that store. And maybe we can encourage more stores to do it with that little tax break I talked about.
And one of the things on the pricing that came up during second reading, right, is that grocery stores were the biggest users of those bags, and they got a bulk rate discount, and their cost was 4.7 cents a bag, if I remember correctly, which meant it was a guaranteed profit for grocery stores to sell you these bags that the government was, saying was bad. But our local businesses who don't get that bulk rate discount, I think they were talking like 15 to 25 cents was their cost per bag. And so it was really, really can be detrimental to our local businesses. And, again, we got to bring everyone to the table and say, how do we do this in a way? Where is there common ground that we all agree on? And maybe we're not going to get in round one everything that we want. But if we can find that agreement for step one, then everyone's going to come back to the table for step two. And once we've gotten that trust with people, then we can build on it and build on it. And baby step continuous improvement, I think, is the way, we're going to have to deal with a lot of these issues, because the heavy-handed approach, in my opinion, is just I look at things at other areas. We're just going back and forth. This guy's in control and he makes a policy, then the next election the other guy's in control, and then he hammers back the other way. And this stagnation and this going back and forth, we're spending a lot of time on overhead and bureaucracy, and we're not moving forward. And we really need to find the ways that we can move forward as a nation, as a city, as a community.
Okay, good point. I think there's some consensus there on that point. But let's go back to what John said earlier about the fact that this is only a 10% solution. How do we breach that gap between 10% and say even just 40% or 50% success in either reducing or reusing plastics? Any ideas?
There are certainly ways that just as everyday consumers, we can send signals to the manufacturers of the products that we buy, that we can signal to them that we'd like them to use more recycled content. For example, when you buy a product that has recycled content in it, you're sending that signal that we'd like to see more of that. You can go beyond that, and it's easier than ever to write a letter. Now it's an email, a tweet, a text message, and corporations are listening to that feedback. There are ways that we can do that individually, or we can get together and talk to the manufacturers.
I know 270 companies have signed on to this MacArthur Foundation group. But you walk into a grocery store or drugstore and you see all of these blister packs and things that, where you used to buy batteries in a little cardboard box with 10 batteries in it, and now it's covered in plastic. And I was in the store the other day looking at bottles of ketchup, and I really wanted one in a glass bottle. And of the 20 varieties of ketchup there was one glass bottle. So what's going to be the impact on the consumer if all of a sudden everybody calls Heinz and says, we don't want you to put our ketchup in plastic bottles anymore. We want glass only, because that's a better use of the resource. What impact is that going to have?
Well, that would have an impact, but the only way you're going to really have an impact on them is probably not writing them letters. You stop buying their product, and that'll get the message there a lot quicker than any way I know.
No, but I mean, well, if everything's packaged back in glass again and we get rid of a lot of this plastic on the grocery store shelves, is that going to increase the cost? Is that going to increase transportation use, increase the gas it takes to put it on the trucks and ship it to the stores? Where do we find the balance between the convenience and economics of plastics?
There's a lot of different lenses, I would say, that you could use to look at the impacts of different choices for packaging. In Colorado, we have a really strong market for glass. Now since a new facility came online about 2 years ago, any glass that goes into your single stream recycling or that you drop off separately at a collection site can go back to being a new bottle within a week or two. And so we have, with all the beer manufacturers, we have really good markets for glass. However, it's also heavy to ship, and it can be a bit damaging on recycling equipment, and so from a greenhouse gas standpoint, also lightweight packaging, especially if it's transporting further distances, can have a lowered impact. So there are some trade-offs with these different choices.
What about glass? I keep hearing that the glass that breaks up in the single stream recycling is lost and ends up in the landfill.
Well, that's what I was referring to. So previous to 2016, it was the case that the single stream glass was being used as a beneficial secondary use. It wasn't becoming new bottles. It wasn't just going to the landfill. But in the last 2 years, we've had Momentum Glass that opened outside of Broomfield, and they're taking all of that broken glass that comes from the recycling systems and turns it into new products, mainly bottles.
And what about the contamination of glass? Is that as much of a problem?
Doesn't contaminate nearly as much as plastic. But I remember, I'm pretty old. I'm rarely not the oldest person in the room. But we used to have a deposit on bottles when I was a kid. And in high school, we used to, at East High in Denver, we had people there who, we called them winos, but we would take those bottles and throw them out and watch them all run and try and get them. It was kind of sport. But the point being, it was worth it to them to go and pick that bottle up. Mm-hmm. And we thought it was fun to lose whatever that was worth to watch them do it. But the point I'm trying to make with this, and I'm not trying to be humorous as much as make the point, that whenever we have talked about deposits on bottles and things which would cause them to come back, the beverage industry goes out of their minds. Yes. I was in this room the night that we voted to bring Anheuser-Busch here, one of those seats up there. And we were talking about a deposit on those kinds of bottles, and they went out of their mind to the point we backed away because we wanted the brewery. And they'll continue to fight that in that industry. But maybe that's a place where we're going to have to come up with a little bigger carrot to figure out how to make industry, especially in the beer business, that doesn't go in plastic bottles. And I don't drink beer, but I've never seen it in a plastic bottle. It's got to be glass or cans or a keg. but anyway, the point being, there's got to be a way to figure out how to at least get that glass back in the system. Then we can start to see ourselves using more and more and more glass. And in my own kitchen, I've got plastic that I save stuff in, but I prefer to be able to put it in a glass container with a lid on it. Mm-hmm. And so I think maybe that is an answer, and glass could be very valuable. We've got some deposits right here in Larimer County that can be used to make glass. The silica sand, I know of several when I was a commissioner, we looked at those, and it was a little contentious because people don't want people digging it up next to their place. But
Yeah.
somehow, you got to get it, you got to be able to use it. But recycling solves a lot of those problems of people who don't want you mining next to their house.
Okay, so several years ago, we started hauling our glass up to the timberline because we knew there were problems with landfill. We don't have to do that anymore.
You have more options than ever to get your glass
Good,
recycled.
glad to hear it.
We still encourage you to source separate if you're going there anyway. Yeah.
Do you get more money for it if it's separated?
I'm not sure exactly of the economics.
Okay,
Sorry.
okay. So deposits on bottles and cans. Several states have put that into effect. Up in New England, I think Maine, Vermont have deposits, but I do agree with you from what I've read that the industry gets very upset if somebody tries to put deposits on cans and bottles.
Maybe not cans so much, because that aluminum has more value. And therefore, I think, I don't know, maybe Honore could tell us if it's more commonly recycled. I bet it is.
Well, anyone who sells a product in a beverage container takes the position in general, as you stated, that it'll cost their consumer more, and so it's a de facto tax on their product. And so that applies to aluminum cans and glass bottles. I don't know if the recycling rate is higher for aluminum cans, but they certainly have the highest value in the recycling stream. And actually, some Northwest states have started to pilot refillable beer bottles. They're doing a pilot project this year where a bunch of breweries have come together, and they're going back to that really old, before the deposit, the actual refilling of the same bottles. So that could be the future.
That could be the future too. Okay. So anybody heard about using rubber in roads or plastic in roads?
Read about it.
Read about it? We're at this point where China's not buying our plastics. So where is it? Where are we? What are we doing with it?
Well, I think technology has given us a lot of options on how to use recyclable materials and particularly plastics. I've read about it going into asphalt or pavement. I think that's a great thing. And I take some comfort in just knowing how much things have changed in Fort Collins in terms of recycling since we moved here 23 years ago. There's been great advances, and I'm hopeful that will continue and that technology will help us find greater uses, especially for plastics.
Do you have any estimates on how successful the recycling program is in Fort Collins?
How successful it is? Oh, it's very successful. Our community is filled with recycling enthusiasts and people who take it seriously and understand their part in this big system. Oftentimes we say that the recycling system globally is a highly dependent yet only loosely connected system. We don't get that feedback. We don't really understand the whole measures of it. But our community really strives to educate themselves about how to do it right. And so for that reason, we have a community recycling rate of over 50%. But for homes and businesses, that's around 30%, which is kind of in the neighborhood of the national average, meaning about 30% of everything we set out at the curb goes to recycling or we compost it, that sort of thing. And overall, I would also say that I don't think that 30% of what gets sent to the recycling center is necessarily trash. Historically, it's been around 8 or 10%, that contamination level in our single stream recycling. I think more recently it has been creeping up, or perhaps they're just looking at it more closely because it's becoming harder to handle these materials. Most recently, I think we've heard it's around 15 to 18%, but it might be different.
Okay, so we talked about banning plastic bags. Anything else we should just get rid of and tell the industry to stop doing? Plastic film?
Well, I personally, I don't know about banning it because John's convinced me that bans aren't a good idea. But a solution to styrofoam. I think that's one of the great frustrations in the recycling world, at least locally. Fort Collins, we don't really have a good solution for that. And we went and bought a new vacuum cleaner the other day, and it came in a nice big box, cardboard box that I know is recyclable, and I'm looking forward to taking to the Timberline Center. but then it also came packed in styrofoam. And what do I do with that? I'm not going to drive it to Boulder, where there is a center that can handle it. So it goes in the trash, and it just breaks my heart. So if we can do something locally, other than address plastic bags, single-use bags, personally, I would like to see something done about styrofoam.
Why is styrofoam such a problem?
It's very light. The density is so low that shipping it as it is really not cost effective. It's very hard to make those economics pencil out. So the only way to really get it recycled, which is what they do at the EcoCycle Charm in Boulder, is you densify it. You basically compress it or melt it so far that it gets all the air out and it becomes these dense, heavy little bricks. And then it's modestly maybe break-even value, but you have to invest up front in the technology to densify it.
Okay, I think we have a question.
My name is Sue Ellen Markey, and I live in Larimer County, just outside the city limits, but use the city's recycling facilities. I guess, you know, on the one hand, it's all sounding actually like there is some progress being made. For those of us who are old enough to remember, and I think I'm probably older than you are, John, but, you know, there were all kinds of things that we lived with, like glass, milk bottles. And my pet peeve is the inability to buy soap powder in cardboard boxes and being steered towards liquid soap in huge plastic containers. You think, you know, everybody's focused on things like the bags and maybe straws. But when you look at the quantity of plastics in some of these other products, so I find myself saying, well, all right, I'm going to exercise my consumer pressure, such as it is. And I guess the question I have that comes out of that is, how effective is that really when the choice gets narrower and narrower and narrower? So 4 or 5 years ago even, I could find twice as many products, soap powders. That's my current hobby horse. Now they're down to 2 at the store where I typically go. I think there have been a lot of incentives that work. I think there are stores that give you a rebate if you use your own bag, as Mary pointed out. There are stores that don't give you a bag at all. You know, if you go to Costco, you take one of their boxes if they have it. Otherwise, you just pile the stuff in your cart. So there are those kinds of things out there. And I can see from your conversation that we're looking at pressure from the bottom and perhaps pressure from the top. But I'm not hearing what kind of pressure is most effective. That's, I'm afraid, a very long-winded way of getting around to it. But so are we talking about 5%? I'd like to see a campaign to get rid of water bottles in a city where we can drink the water. Now, they make sense when I lived in India. But you're right, they all ended up in the street or in the water. So where are the best pressure points? Could you go back to that and give us some concrete examples of where you think it's worked?
Well, I'll throw in, you know, the European Union recently proposed a total ban or discontinuance over several years of all single-use plastics, because they found that relying on individual consumer pressure or pressure on the industry wasn't going to work. So they said, we're done talking about it. We have to do this, and we have to do it now. So what is the best solution? For consumers to put pressure on, for governments to put pressure on, for governments to enact legislation that will push industry to making changes? Let's start with Mike. What do you think the best solution is?
Well, I think where we start the conversation at is kind of the cradle to grave impact of the product. And the question to start with is, what is the impact of putting the plastic there or the single use? And is it actually being captured, the environmental I mean, if we pollute something, then we need money to clean it up, right? Is that money being captured in our current consumer price and tipping fees? And I think that's a good place to start, because it might turn out that by making everyone pay their fair share of that cost, that actually creates the market for the alternatives. Are we subsidizing the pollution, if you will? And can we end that subsidy? And short of that, I do like the deposit model. I mean, when I was a kid, that was our job as kids. If we wanted to go to the movie or go get a candy bar or something, we had to take the wagon and go door to door and ask neighbors for deposit bottles, and we would go get our money for our deposit bottles. With car parts, you've done core charges for a long time. I have heard that there's some places where they'll charge you 5 cents for the can, but you only get 2.5 back, or where whoever's supposed to collect the can or the bottles isn't collecting them. So I'd want to make sure we work through those issues and make sure the system works. I think that's a good place to start.
Do you think it starts with a city ordinance? Should we go state level or federal level? Because you're talking about things that take governmental action.
Given the widespread of it, my microphone is there we go. I think it's kind of a statewide issue at least. So I would like to see, the state, maybe the Department of Human Health and Environment launch a study and then, and look at it very objectively and data, not politically, and help us. And so that way all the cities and other communities can leverage off that study and do what works for them. Because not all cities are the same, right? And maybe we're ready to do straws and another city's ready to do plates, right? And so I like the idea of that shared report coming out of a higher level government that gives lower level governments options on how to move forward.
Okay.
May I say something?
Honore, yes.
I appreciate your question, and I think that there is a really direct link between our individual and community choices, the things we choose to buy and carry and not buy, and changes that happen up at that high level, either at the state, federal, at the corporate level. I think that when we have a culture of disposability and convenience overall, that becomes the norm, and everyone's okay with taking, however many pieces of packaging or having the straw, and then as soon as one thing changes, this summer we all saw the picture of the turtle with a straw, unfortunately stuck in its face, and people really were moved by that image. Is stopping the use of single-use straws going to have that 100% impact? No, it's not even 1%. But it is a gateway to a different way of thinking about our own choices, and again, sending signals to the manufacturers that we actually are ready for a new way of working with the materials so that it doesn't just have to deal with waste at the end, but actually reducing what we generate in the first place. So I think there's a link there. We start with our own choices, and it moves upwards.
And then it'll move upward. Okay. Kevin?
I'm sorry, what did you say?
Oh, I said Honore's point is they think it starts with the consumer and then moves upward.
I think the pressure points in response to your question can be multiple. It can certainly start at the governmental level, as been discussed already, and from the consumer side. And I think industry, at least some industry, will respond. I mean, we're already hearing from Kroger, the big grocery store with multiple chains, that they're going to phase out multiple or single-use plastic bags starting next year in Seattle and be across their all 2,800 stores by 2025. So it's kind of slow, but it's happening, and I think it does show the responsiveness, especially on the retail side, which is so image conscious that a certain tweet will get their attention. You know what I mean? And they will respond and make changes.
Okay, I think we have another question.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm fascinated by the conversation about take-back programs, and I wonder if anybody could speak to some of the European models, like for packaging. When you buy something like Kevin's vacuum cleaner, that the merchant that you bought it from has a role in helping you find a way to get that styrofoam recycled, and maybe takes it back at the store and helps get it to the right recycling facility.
So the Green Dot program is one example of that Germany implemented more than a decade ago, and it basically put the responsibility of the packaging on the manufacturer. And so overnight, the country saw the packaging waste reduced, many-fold, because suddenly people were doing just that. They were taking the package and leaving it at the store when they took their product home. And so it sent this exact signal.
Oh, that's what we could all do. When we go to the store, we take it out of the
Certainly could.
package and we leave the packaging behind. I think that's a great idea.
How are you going to? Well, what about the soap?
Yeah, the plastic, well, that's as I explained
I'm
earlier,
thinking-
that's been one of my big dilemmas
But I
too.
will say that I really appreciated Sue Ellen's comment, because I'm thinking if I'm in the grocery business and I'm selling these kinds of things, maybe what I ought to be encouraging people to do is to bring back their either bottle or can or whatever they're putting their soap in and sell it in bulk so that they can just fill theirs up and go on home with it. We see them doing that already with some things, flour and other big
Yeah, the
bins. The
bulk
problem is
bins.
they've also got the plastic bags there to put it.
To fill it in, yes, but you can't take your own container.
You could.
And have them
I
weigh
think
it.
that's maybe a
And that's
solution.
what I do with the book.
But it would take a little change in retailing, but
Yes.
maybe that could happen.
Okay, I have two things that I've thought a lot about, like the single bags. Okay, when you go to get all your vegetables and your fruits at the grocery store, and so your choice is you have to put it on the ramp, and then it's dirty. So how do you get rid of the single-use plastic bags there? And then the other one is this idea of taking it back to the store when we are now a society of mail order.
And that's, I would like to see personally, and, I'm supposed to be the moderator and not really into this, but one thing I would like to see is that when you order something online, that they actually tell you how they ship things. They tell you what their packaging materials are before you order it. I order from a flour company in Vermont, and they put right in their catalog that all their packages are shipped with paper, that there's nothing but paper in the box. So that's something I would like to see. But John, I think back to you on the final question of who should be taking the lead in some of these solutions? Should it be the consumer, the industry, or government? Because
Well, I
this
think
is-
it's going to take a partnership of all three people, but consumers drive the rest of that. Voters drive what happens in government. And the constituents of a city council or a bunch of county commissioners can have an impact on what those folks do. If they don't do what they want now, they'll get them at the ballot box. We saw that this week. It really works. The other thing is consumers really have a demand of businesses. And I don't see businesses just doing stuff because they think it's good for them. They have to be able to persuade you and me and everybody else that that's the best way to get this product, and therefore we're going to buy it. Otherwise, they're not successful. And so we may have to be sending a different message as consumers to those folks as to what we want, what we expect, and what we'd like to see them do. And I'm seeing that start to happen. But again, I'm not a real fan of, I've made a lot of laws in my life. And I'd prefer to make fewer of those and let people do the right thing for the right reasons.
Okay, let's finish up with a brief discussion of the new Larimer County landfill. Because one question I've seen a couple of places is this the opportunity for the city to take a leadership role and say, we won't even take these items into our landfill? But tell us a little bit about the plans for this new landfill and its life, and what's going to happen up in Wellington.
Well, having run that landfill for 4 years of my life and been out there and actually seen it operate, we made the decision several times in history to make it taller. And we have that property next to it that's not going to be able to be used. So the new one's going to happen. But there is also a debate going on, if you will, or a discussion as to whether or not we ought to just privatize it and use the landfill, and some people call it Alt and some people call it Pierce? Or should we replace it in the county, stay in the landfill business? Because we've got communities besides Fort Collins. It's about half of overall Larimer County, but then we got the rest of the folks we got to take care of, and that includes Loveland. But I've read the plan as to what might happen. It seems like it's going to stay in the governmental process instead of private based on these recommendations. So I
follow
think
up
it's
on that too?
good what they're doing.
Yeah, thanks. So the new proposed landfill that the county would like to build is only one piece, really, of a larger system for resource recovery and waste handling. And we've been talking tonight exclusively pretty much about recycling, but it's important to note that at least in Fort Collins, compostable materials, that's, food waste, green waste, paper towels, that makes up about half of what homes and businesses are throwing in the landfill. And so the new plan, kind of a master plan that's being reviewed right now and hopefully could be adopted by the county before the end of the year, calls for not only a new landfill, but a convenient one-stop transfer station for trash so that residents and haulers don't have to drive up to the working face of the landfill, as well as new facilities for composting food waste and yard waste, and a sorting facility for construction materials. So there's some really exciting stuff on the horizon that the
And you can get this online, and there's even a nice page that shows pictures of all of these different things that Honore just talked about. And this is where the county and the cities together, mainly we have Fort Collins and Loveland, but don't say that to the folks in Wellington and places like that.
Okay, Kevin, want to throw in a final word about what you'd like to see happen?
Well, first I'd like to say thank you for having us here this evening. It's been a great conversation. And as far as the waste shed plan, I think the regional cooperation that's going into it is really quite remarkable. It's not the sort of thing that we often see. I personally would like to see lots of options for recycling at the center, at least being able to handle very specific items, such as my favorite, plastic bags, and other more difficult things that are difficult things to recycle.
And I hope to soon see fewer plastic bags flying around my neighborhood in the wind. Michael?
So before we went live on camera, we were talking about the fact that there might be a plan to make this the last landfill in Larimer County. And I think that is a goal that we should have. We should state it publicly on the plan. And, I like the idea of composting. I read someplace 50% of our stuff that's in the landfill could be composted. I know there used to be a composting facility out east, but it got closed for some reason. I didn't really follow it much, but we do need to work with that and make sure we have those other facilities online. And I think, one of the things I really like is the whole waste shed management plan that the landfill is part of. And I think when we do those comprehensive plans, we're making big steps in the right direction.
Okay. Thank you, Michael. Okay. Thank you to our panel and our viewing audience for joining us tonight. Many companies, cities, counties, and coalitions are studying this issue and proposing solutions that will embrace the advantages and the need for plastic in our lives while limiting the harm they can do to people, animals, and the environment. This is No Straw November, a campaign to raise awareness not just about straws, but about single-use plastics. We encourage you to become educated about this and other issues that affect our community and our future. And thank you to our panel. I hope you enjoy your stainless steel straw. This CrossCurrents program will be rebroadcast at various times during the month on FCTV channels 14 and 881. Please check your local listing for exact times and dates. The video is available at the League of Women Voters website at lwvlarimercounty.org. Thank you.